Has anybody here ever used it? Okay. So, well, that's good, because it's always good to know about a new statute, a new set of tools, and then I actually can tell you about it. The Environmental Bill of Rights is a very unusual and special statute that's not found in the other provinces in Canada, and it gives everyone in Ontario the right to participate in significant environmental decisions of the provincial government. And one of my jobs is to be the guardian of that statute, and so you may have seen there's a few flyers here at the front, which includes an introduction to the Environmental Bill of Rights. We have that available in 15 languages, including 3 Indigenous languages. They are all available on our website, and they're all available from our office as well. One of my jobs is to report to the legislature. So I'm independent, I'm nonpartisan. I'm appointed by all the parties together. I'm not appointed by the government. I don't report to the government. I owe no loyalty to the government. On the contrary, it's my job to criticize the government. And it's because I'm independent that I still have a job at this point. It's true. The other thing that's important to note is that I am required to be nonpartisan but not neutral on the 3 topics on which the parties that I serve most violently disagree, which is energy, environment, and climate. So it's a very interesting line that I try to walk, and I have, of course, no peers across the country. My only direct peer is in New Zealand. There's an environmental commissioner there. So I have a very unusual job, shepherding a very unusual statute, and then making these reports to the legislature on energy, environment, and climate. And basically, it's my job to tell truth to power, to report the facts without fear or favor, and that means that for sure someone is always unhappy. In fact, quite often, everybody's unhappy about something, which is, I guess, fair. So these are pictures of my 3 most recent reports. The one on the left, environmental protection. This is about the things that people normally think about in terms of environment: air, land, water, pollution, wildlife, water, woodlands, wetlands, that kind of thing. Last year's report, well, I guess the summaries are gone, but it is available on the website. A new report will be available this year. The second one is on electricity. So if any of you have questions about electricity, why are our rates what they are, you'll hear a great deal of what's said in public and in the newspaper about electricity, why prices are up, what the options are to reduce it, the Green Energy Act, all those sorts of things. And from where I sit, most of what you hear in public is not true. The reason we did this report was specifically to try to set out the facts in the hope that, somewhat naive hope, that facts are still useful in public debate on important public policy issues. So if you're interested in that, that's what the electricity report is for. My most recent report is on climate. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about mostly today. I also have 3 other reports, some of which may be useful to you. One of them is on stormwater. Right? We know that Ontario has worse and worse flooding problems, is going to have worse and worse flooding problems going forward. We've got a roughly $6.8 billion deficit in stormwater infrastructure, which increases the risk not only of environmental degradation but also of flooding. We know that that's going to get worse. We know that climate change is making it worse. We know that intensification is making it worse. And so we have a stormwater report on that problem and how it should be funded and why stormwater area fees are so important. We've also got a report on waste, waste, blue box, circular economy, and one on soil and soil health. You may have, I don't know, do you handle rural lands as well, or just, yes? So for rural lands as well, you may find the soil health piece important because we have a huge problem in Ontario with deterioration of soil. So I hope you know we've had about a 30% deterioration in soil organic matter in the last generation or so. And that's bad for everything I care about. It's bad for food quality, it's bad for erosion, it's bad for nutrients getting into the water, which creates algae blooms. It makes the land more susceptible to drought, it makes the land more susceptible to floods, and of course we're going to have more of both floods and droughts. So partly through the efforts of our office, the Ministry of Agriculture and Food has finally recognized that soil health is an important issue, and they say they're at least going to study it, which I guess is a start. So we have a report on that as well. And they're all available on our website. Now, another tool that we have is, would you find it helpful to know when the government is either making or proposing an environmentally significant decision on something that interests you? Okay, would you like to get that for free? Okay, well, so under the Environmental Bill of Rights, the province is required to consult the people when proposing or making an environmentally significant decision. They don't always do it, especially these days, but they are required to do it by law, and I'm always harrying them to get them to do it and to do it better. But the current registry software stinks. So you can find things there if you go and search them and if you know all of the tricks, which includes the fact that they have things very badly sorted. But that works badly. So what works much better is to go to my website, which is eco.on.ca, and if you don't remember that, just look up Environmental Commissioner and you'll find it. But if you want to write it down, it's eco.on.ca, and you can see where the red arrow is. There's a little green box that says Get Registry Notices That Interest You. So if you click on that box and you sign up, you put in your email address and you put in the keyword that you want. That could be a postal code. It could be a topic. It could be a municipal name. You could use any keyword you want. I mean, if you put water in, you'll get an awful lot of notices. But the more specific you can be of what you're looking for, the more specific the notices will be. We've sent out over 1 million of these free notices in the last couple of years, and that's greatly increasing people's ability to at least know what the government is proposing to do, which gives you an opportunity to comment. And when people comment, the government is obliged to read the comments and to consider them and to report back what they're doing. They don't always do what you want, but at least they're required to know, to take into account your opinion. And very often local people know things the government doesn't know. It's very Canadian to assume that if you know something, they know it already. Don't take that for granted. So that's a tool. How many of you will be able to use that tool? Yeah? How many of you have someone else you could tell about it? Okay, please do. So that takes me to my most recent report, which looks like this. We do have summaries available at the front. We're glad to send you more if you like. We are anxious for people to know, but we do this work at public expense, and we do want people to know. Now, this is basically what's in the report. This report doesn't do the basics of climate science. What I find going around Ontario, and I've given hundreds of talks at this point, is that very few people understand what exactly is climate change anyway. Is it really all that serious? Is it, how fast is it moving? Do we really have to worry about it that much? And if you're interested in those kinds of questions, I don't have time to give you my climate science presentation today, or most of it, but there is a webinar on our website for free. You can watch anytime. If you want more information about it, you can contact our office. But this is what we put in this year's report. So 5 main chapters. The first chapter is basically about the past. A little bit about what's happening in Ontario right now. And a bit of that I'm going to be able to show you. A lot about sort of what's been happening in Ontario climate policy. Were we on the right track or not? And then what's happened in the last 4 months. So that's the first part. The rest of it is about, okay, well, where could we go from here? We still need a strong climate law. We don't have one. Well, it's still a law in Ontario, but it's going to be revoked probably in the next few days. So even without cap and trade, we could still make sensible decisions in Ontario. So the rest of the report is mostly about that, and I'm not talking about that very much today. Chapter 4, though, might be interesting to you, and it's about our vulnerability. Because climate change is here, it's already starting to cause enormous damage across Ontario, and there is much, much, much more coming, and we haven't done even the basics to figure out how to prepare, what to prepare for, how to build new. We've really just been keeping our head in the sand like an ostrich. The other part of the report is the appendices. This is background information, and most people find most helpful Appendix B. A lot of people are really curious is what was the cap and trade money used for? Because there were a lot of suggestions about that, about it being misused or used unfairly or not doing any good, and those things are basically not true. But if you want the details, they're in Appendix B. I'll be able to talk a little bit about that. So, So I do ask everybody when I talk about climate, is there any young person that you care deeply about? Somebody? Okay. I am absurdly fond of these two, even though they're really noisy. They just tear my house apart when they come over. But It's really important to think about them because climate change affects us now. It's changing our lives now, but it's going to have an enormously larger effect on theirs. Sometimes you read in the paper people talk about, well, by 2100 this, that, and the other, and that sounds impossibly far away. But these little boys, you know, statistically, would still be alive by then. So they're going to live through the most extraordinary, devastating, horrible things that we have unleashed. This is about them. It is not just about polar bears anymore. So, but even aside from, you know, what we hear in the research is that most people, even if they basically accept the science, climate change is very serious, it's real, it's us, it's here, it's important, all that stuff, they think really sort of, so what? Most people still don't think it really doesn't matter to me. So I spend a lot of time talking to people about it, why it matters to us. So we just had the report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I hope you saw in the paper there was a big report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in the last couple of weeks. People saw something about that in the paper? Right. So basically what that report is telling us is we're already at about 1 degree warming in the world as an average. We're heading towards 3 or 4 within the lifetime of those little boys. But this report was about the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Because 25 years ago, when the world agreed on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in other words, when the whole world knew that climate change was a serious and important issue, the general idea was, well, 2 degrees of change is probably safe-ish. We can manage at 2 degrees. We'll still have food security. We won't have a lot of wars triggered by climate change. We'll still have water. You know, we'll still have basically a life that we can recognize at 2 degrees. And what the new report shows us is that's not a safe assumption. It's just not true. We're in for really robust changes, including ecosystem collapses of various kinds at 1.5 degrees, and much more robust changes beyond that at 2 degrees. But what I want to show you here is in Ontario, we've already blown past 1.5 degrees. We've had 1.5 degrees of warming basically in my lifetime. And we're on track for another 2.5 to 4 degrees in the next few decades. So of course we're already seeing changes. And we're going to see much more change. Yes?
You mentioned that diagram there is in an upcoming report.
Oh, so this particular diagram, it's available on our website. This one's, I just had this one updated. And I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly, but I think I still have that one in the report that's here. We also have a full description of climate science in last year's climate report. If you have any trouble finding it, just email my office and we'll be glad to show you. But one of the, whoops, I banged this. So what this is, that I wanted to show you is that climate change is not the same everywhere. It has really local effects. This is a map that I had done by the mathematical crunchers at York University with the latest information we have about growing seasons in Ontario. And what you can see is that there are parts of Ontario where the growing seasons are now increasing 13 days a decade. That's light speed if you're a tree. Can I do spotting on this? No. Yes? Okay. And if you look there, that's one of the areas that's warming the fastest in Ontario. That's warming about 7 or 8 days a decade. Where did we have the worst forest fires this summer? BC for sure, but what about Ontario? Where did we have the worst forest fires? Where it's hottest, right? Because when it's hottest and driest, what happens to the soil? What happens to the trees? They get warmer, they get drier, they dry out, and so when a spark comes, what happens? They burn, right? There's no magic to this. There are, of course, other factors. I reported specifically on forest fire. We have a lot of other forest management reasons why we're incredibly vulnerable to very, very bad fires. But climate is part of it. Climate is never the whole reason for things, but it loads the dice. It makes everything else harder to manage. Anyway, this one, if you want, I put it up on LinkedIn. I can email it to you. Ali's got, I guess, a copy of the presentation, so you can use it. And I give you the site where it comes from. So, but the other thing I want you to see is it's really local. Right? There are parts of Ontario that are seeing this very, very quick change. in growing seasons, and there's parts of Ontario that are seeing no change whatsoever. So climate change is not just a world thing, it's also a very local thing. This is just to give you an example of how average temperatures have changed, and this is from Toronto. So yes, it's a lot warmer now than it used to be. And this is exacerbated by urban heat island effect. Have you heard of the urban heat island effect? Yes, no, some yes. Thank you for being honest. If I use a phrase that I haven't explained, please ask me. So if you're in an area where what's around you is grass and trees, generally it stays fairly moderate, right? The grass and the trees, they absorb the sun, they give back the heat at night, and you keep a fairly moderate temperature. If instead of that you have parking lots and hard impermeable roofs, what happens in the daytime? You get an enormous amount of heat absorbed into the concrete and the asphalt, and then what happens at night? You get that heat back. And so it means that as the nights get warmer, and they are, if you're also getting heat radiated back from parking lots, we have a larger and larger number of nights a year where people don't sleep properly without air conditioning. Guess who doesn't have air conditioning? The poorer people, right? And who are also often in older buildings. And so those folks, if they can't sleep at night, what happens to the kids the next day at school? What happens to their possibility of holding a job if they didn't sleep night after night after night? And so we have these effects of urban design, which are, again, reinforcing the changes that climate change is bringing, and usually it increases inequality, and it's going to also increase social stress. When are we most likely to have violence in the streets? Right? People can't sleep, can't get jobs, can't graduate from school. This is making all of that worse. We've also got health effects. So I hope you folks all know that Brantford is now in the danger area for Lyme disease. Yes? You know this? Does everybody know how to do a tick check? No? You better find out. But you know, this really changes people's lives. When I was a little kid, my parents sent me off to camp, and we, you know, all sorts of things could go wrong. I could burn my finger in the fire, and I did, and I could fall off rocks and hit myself, and I did. But, you know, I wasn't going to kill myself. And when my kids were little, I could take them camping to Algonquin and let them romp in a field with tall grass. And honestly, the worst thing they were going to get, they were going to burn their fingers in the fire, which they did. They were going to fall off rocks, which they did, and maybe they're going to get burrs. But I wasn't putting their life at risk. Now, my grandchildren, when I take them out into the woods, I'm frightened about ticks. Everywhere I go in Ontario now, well, especially in those yellow areas, I go to the audiences and I say, so I was in Barrie giving a talk a couple of weeks ago, and I asked them, how many people here know personally someone who's had now West Nile or Lyme disease, both of which climate change has brought us? About a tenth of the people put their hands up. I know of someone who's a very, very bright, high-powered woman in the middle of her working life, in the prime of her life, can't work anymore because of Lyme disease. So this is already changing people's lives, and we're just at the beginning. There's lots of other health effects that we know come from climate change. You think about the heat. I mean, I hope you noticed that dozens of people died in Quebec from the heat wave last year. We also had deaths in Toronto, but nobody was investigating that. Extreme weather events, just the poor air quality. When it's hotter, you get poor air quality. And water stress, of course, is an issue as well. Now, we talk a lot about climate change. You won't see, I don't use the phrase global warming, because although on average the world is warming, when people use the phrase global warming, they tend to think it means that everywhere is warmer all the time, especially when I'd like it to be warmer. Right? So if you get a cold snap, people say, oh, well, it can't be global warming, it's bloody cold. We had that senator who walked into the US Senate with a snowball and said, see, that global warming's a hoax, it's cold outside. That isn't how it works, folks. The world is a really big place. And temperature increases are not uniformly distributed, not in the same place and not at the same time. So the old joke goes, if your head's in the oven and you have third-degree burns and your feet are in the freezer and you have frostbite, on average you are? On average, you're fine, right? But in reality, you are not fine. It's very often the extremes that do most of the damage, and it's the extremes that will do most of the damage that we notice earlier. Now, you remember that young person you told me you cared about? How many of you would like that person to be in a car driven by someone who's been drinking alcohol? Hands up, please. Okay. Why don't you want them in that car? Is it the smell? Okay, why don't you want them in the car? They're more likely to have an accident. In fact, they're about 3 to 4 times more likely to have an accident. So the kids are with us, but we already have 3 times the risk of extreme events. We already have 3 times the frequency of extreme events. And this is just the beginning, because we know, I didn't get a chance to walk you through the science of the greenhouse gases, but yes, sir.
The warming around GTA,
Yes?
on the previous map, they were like the 1.5, that was an average for Southern Ontario or all of Ontario?
Yes, that's right.
I'm curious, the GTA, how's that warming compared to the Brent period or London, southwestern Ontario?
Well, the best thing I've got is this map. I don't have a map that exactly matches what you want, but as you can see, most of southern Ontario is fairly even, except a few places near the lakes, which are cooler. So I don't see on the map a big difference between Brantford and Toronto, other than the urban heat island effect would make it worse. So the nights would be warmer in Toronto. In fact, the days would be warmer from all that asphalt as well. But you guys are building a lot of asphalt. Since I was a young lawyer, you got a hell of a lot more asphalt than you did when I was young, and so you're going to heat up too. Sun's going to burn just as hot on your parking lots as it does on the ones in Toronto.
Well, hey, I'm curious about the effect of the airport and the air traffic there as well.
Right, so the big effect of the airport is it's on global climate change and it's on local air quality. So I haven't really talked about air quality here, which is another, like air toxics. But we do know that the biggest, for most parts of Ontario, the biggest environmental health threat is tailpipe emissions from fossil fueled vehicles. And that would include airplanes, but also cars and trucks. So if you think of a house or a daycare or a kindergarten, a hospital on a busy road, those people are breathing really dirty air. And that dirty air reduces their life expectancy, and we also know that it increases the risk of dementia.
Aren't the automobiles minimal?
No, they're not. They're huge. Individually, each one is much better than they used to be, but we drive so many more kilometers, there are so many more cars, that the total impact is really quite significant. Anyway, I'm going to keep trying to blast through the report and then I'll come back to questions. So, right, so extreme events. So Canada and the United States, we're some of the luckiest people in the world. We're a long way from the equator. There's a lot of landmass away from the oceans, and even so, we've already got triple the number of extreme events. But what I wanted to explain to you about this is that there's a real lag between the time we put greenhouse gas emissions, which are in Ontario mostly from vehicles. The largest part of our greenhouse gas emissions are from vehicles. And the largest part of that is us individuals driving around in personal vehicles. So every time we put a ton of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it takes about a generation before we really start to feel the effects. So there isn't a perfect metaphor for this, but you can think about a bathtub. So if you've got a bathtub and the tap leaks a little bit and the stopper leaks a little bit, if they both match, so you get a little bit of water dripping in and a little bit of water dripping out, if they're the same, what happens to the level of water in the bathtub? Nothing, right? But if you start putting some hairs into the drain, what happens? Right? Maybe 1 hair doesn't change much, maybe 2 hairs don't change much, maybe 3 hairs don't change much, but you're slowing how the water can get out of the bathtub, but the water's still dripping in at the top. Eventually, what's going to happen? It's going to overflow. We have a little bit of the same kind of thing with the atmosphere. The greenhouse gases that we're putting into the air, they're like those hairs. The sun's heat is still arriving every day, just as it always does. Okay, there's a cycle, there's all sorts of normal cycles. There's an orbital cycle, there's a solar cycle, there's the Pacific oscillation, there's all kinds of natural cycles. And there have always been natural cycles. But when we put greenhouse gases into the air, we're closing the windows for the heat to escape back into space, which is where most of it used to go. And when the heat can't escape into space, but it keeps arriving every day from the sun, what happens? The more heat, it builds up. Most of that heat is building up in the oceans, most of that is building up in the southern oceans, which is why Antarctica is starting to come apart. But it takes a generation for us to really start to feel the impact of what we released today. So the extreme events that we're experiencing today, and this chart only goes up to 2016, is mostly from the emissions that we did a generation ago or more. We haven't yet started to experience what we've done in the last 25 years, but it's coming as we've locked it in. So, so extreme events, well, they didn't start with climate change, but climate change certainly loads the dice and makes them more common, more frequent, more intense. So here's just a few recent ones. You might remember 2016. So it wasn't as bad here as it was in parts of the province. In the Quinte Conservation Area, for example, lots of wells went dry. According to the Conservation Authority, that included every single fire well. Every single well that the volunteer fire departments rely on to fill their trucks to put out fires was dry in the summer of 2016. That wasn't the problem in 2017. Or, for that matter, here in the spring of 2018, or not the spring, February. So this is one of the other things that's starting to happen. Conservation authorities are seeing. There used to be some predictability in when you'd have your spring floods. It would be in the spring, right? But now you get them January, February, March, April, May, June, you can have floods. Because the weather is more unpredictable, it oscillates more up and down, above and below zero, and so we're getting all kinds of consequences, in which can include the sort of thing that you had. Now, we didn't just have floods, we also had fires. Now, somebody said, we were really comparatively lucky compared to lots of other places. It was much, much worse in California. It was much, much worse in British Columbia, which has now had 2 consecutive years with more than 1 million hectares burned each year. It was much worse in many parts of the world. The Arctic was on fire. But even here we had impacts, and then of course we also had the tornadoes. Now you put all that together, you want to talk about money. You guys know how important it is property insurance is, right? You have to have property insurance to get a mortgage, right? Okay, so look what's happening to property insurance. So this is insured losses in Ontario, just in Ontario and just from extreme weather events. Now this, not yet. How about that one? All right. Now this chart isn't up to date. I didn't get time to update it yesterday. As of September, we're up to $1.2 billion just in Ontario of extreme weather losses in the first 9 months of 2018. But anyway, you can get a sense. This is constant dollars, there's no inflation in these figures. And this is just insured losses, and as you probably know, we can assume, rule of thumb, there's at least the same amount of uninsured losses on top of that, of uninsured financial losses, as well as a large number of other losses that aren't measured in money. Another thing I want you to notice about this chart is if you look carefully, you'll see there's 2 different colors, right? On the left-hand side, these numbers are all sort of in light blue, and then on the right-hand side, they're in dark blue. I hope you can see that. Okay, so this is statistics from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And until 2008, they would give us figures for all extreme weather losses in Ontario. But since 2008, they only give us catastrophic events, anything where the individual event was over 25 million. So if we included everything, the numbers would be much higher again. But even leaving out all the small events, look what is happening to insured losses in Ontario. Now, you probably know insurance companies are not charities. Right? Do you think this will affect the cost of insurance? Do you think this will affect the availability of insurance? Well, this is what the Insurance Bureau tells me. Now, 10% of Canadian properties soon ineligible for private flood insurance. Now, they tell me that maybe half of those, maybe 5%, could be made insurable, if the property owner takes sufficient precautions, if the municipality takes sufficient precautions. But that still leaves 5% that won't be. So this stuff is starting to get really close to people's pocketbooks. In the United Kingdom, they've already been over this hump. In 2007, don't know if you noticed, they had the largest destruction of civil infrastructure in the United Kingdom since the Luftwaffe. Do you know what it was? It was floods. And it wasn't the sea rising and it wasn't the rivers overflowing, it was rain. Because we now, one of the things climate change does is it makes the rain more intense. Sometimes very, very locally. You can get a 10-kilometer wide convective storm that will just dump an overwhelming amount of rain in a small place. The other thing climate change does is it slows the jet stream. So we're famous in Canada for having hit-and-run weather, according to the weatherman. That is, we always used to be able to count that by and large every 3 days the weather would change, would blow through. But climate change reduces the temperature difference between the Arctic and the equator and the mid-latitudes. And what that's doing is slowing down the jet stream. And what that means is that sometimes you get a really big storm like Harvey and it just stays put and dumps water. And when you get that, it doesn't matter if you're in a river valley or not. It doesn't matter if you're in a floodplain or not. We haven't designed stormwater infrastructure for anything like the kinds of dumps of water that we're starting to see around the world. So, this stuff is coming. Now, Ontario, until June, was generally on the right track. It took us a long time to get going, but our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions in 2016, which is the last year reported, they were the lowest since we started reporting in 1990. And we did that at the very same time as we grew population and we grew GDP. Now, when I was a young lawyer, it was very clearly understood by anyone who knew anything that this is impossible. That emission growth and GDP growth had to go together, and it didn't in Ontario. Our greenhouse gas emissions, they went up from 1990, they went up quite a lot from 1990 to 2000, but they came back down again. And do you know why? Because we took coal out of electricity. Now, in a way, we were lucky about that. So if you see that chart, some of you are old enough to remember, but you may not remember. So how did it happen that our coal use went up, went down, went up, and went down again? Anybody remember? So let me tell you the story. So you can see here that in around 1990, we were using a fair bit of coal. But then, in 1992, we opened the Darlington nuclear plant. So we started making a lot of nuclear electricity. We make 63% of our electricity roughly from nuclear now. In 1992, we got the new Darlington plant. We got lots of coal, nuclear-fired electricity, so our coal electricity went down. So what happened to our air quality? It got better, right? When things get better, people hardly ever notice, right? They just think that's natural. It's just natural that things should be the way I like it. Nobody really noticed. But then, we had a problem. Anybody remember? We had a huge safety problem in the nuclear plants. And we shut 7 nuclear units all at once. What happened to our coal use? What happened to the air quality? Do you remember when anytime you came near Toronto, there was that yellow smear across the, right? Do you remember that? Okay, that wasn't accidental. That was the coal plants. Our coal plants and the US coal plants. That was deliberate public policy that we were pumping that filth into our air. And because of this, right? Because if it sort of stayed steady, maybe nobody would have noticed. But because it went dramatically up after having been down, people noticed and people were outraged. And the public health organizations all spoke up and protested. So in the 2003 election, every single one of the parties pledged to shut down the coal plants. None of them would check by bothering to check first what we were going to do for electricity instead. But anyway, they all pledged to shut the coal plants. And we did, in fact. The last coal plant shut in Ontario in April of 2014. Anybody remember how many smog days we had in 2005? Anybody in their family who's got asthma or lung issues? We had 53 smog days in 2005. Those were brutally hard days for my husband and the nearly 1 million people in Ontario who've got asthma. How many smog days did we have in 2014? 2015? Right? Closing the coal plants made a huge difference to people's lives. Of course, it also put electricity rates up. When you heard people complaining about electricity rates, did anybody say to you, but I'm really, really glad that I don't have to take my kid to the hospital? People take good for granted. They complain about what they don't like. The old joke when I was a lawyer was, if I took a case and I lost, it's because the lawyer was no good, but if I took a case and won, it was because the client was right. People always assume that if things go well, that's just the way it should be. Yes, sir?
Aren't they using more coal in the U.S. again?
They're using less coal in the U.S. And since 2010, I think the current number is there are 257 coal plants that have closed or are slated for closure. So I mean, what I said, a lot of what you read in the newspapers about this stuff is just not true. I don't know where it is. Let's see that. All right, so lots of other things help get our emissions down. One of the big ones for you guys to think about is land use, because our biggest emissions are from transportation and our fastest growing emissions. So what this chart shows you is how emissions have changed since 1990. So you can see on the right, our electricity emissions are way down, right? Our industrial emissions are way down. What's up? Transportation and buildings, and most of that is because of land use. Most of that is because of urban sprawl. Most of that is because we have deliberately built southern Ontario as if that we had all the land we need and there are never going to be any consequences for using it up, and we have all the petroleum we need and there are never going to be any consequences for using it. And both of those things are false. But we have built community after community to be dependent on long drives in a car. We've also built our economy more and more for long drives in trucks. So, in that situation, we had a climate law that came into effect January 1st, 2017, and a lot of my report is to show you that, in fact, it was working. Cap and trade was starting to work, and it did work well. Now, admittedly, it was ferociously complicated, and nobody understood it, and it was very easy to demonize it because it was complicated. And it was designed to be economically the most efficient. In other words, to do the most economic good at the lowest cost instead of being the most popular. So the federal government's now trying to go the other direction. But what was the money used for? So, I certainly heard during the election a number of people say that the money was being taken unjustly and wasted. Now, how many people here would like to pay taxes unjustly and then have the money wasted? Right? Nobody. But that isn't what I found. So, do you know what the cap and trade money was being used for? It was being used to reduce emissions, and it was being used mostly for public services. So if you think about municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals, public transit, the public services that we all pay for out of our taxes to run, they have been methodically starved of capital for a very long time, so they tend to be very inefficient. They've been built cheap. So it's cheap to build because the government tends to always count the initial capital cost as the important factor, but expensive to run. And one of the big costs for running them has been in energy. And they've never been given the money to change how they operate the buildings. Cap and trade did that. So about $1.5 billion of the cap and trade money went to public services to help them be more efficient. So one of the classic stories that I keep telling people is about the Elliott Lake Hospital. It's really cold in Elliott Lake. Anybody been to Elliott Lake? Okay, well, anyway, you know where it is. It's cold. And like many hospitals, it was put up in the 60s or so, and the building was not built very well, and the HVAC equipment was out of date, and it cost a fortune to run. So they updated their heating and ventilation equipment, improved some of the building envelope, and they're now saving $300,000 every single year, which they're putting back into patient care. All of the hospitals in Ontario were on track to save $60 million a year, which they were going to put back into patient care. But all of that, of course, has now been canceled. Now, we know there's lots of other important co-benefits to reducing the use of fossil fuels, which is our main source of greenhouse gases. Anybody know how much money we drain out of the economy every single year importing fossil fuels? Pick a number. $11 billion every year, and the next year, and the next year. Does that create any jobs here? If we were 10% more efficient, we could keep an extra $1 billion in the economy. Did anybody think of anything good we might do with $1 billion? We also have significant public health benefits if we can reduce emissions into the air. We know we can increase employment. We know that we can make our businesses more competitive if they are more efficient. They can reduce their operating costs. We know that we could expect an increase in GDP if we focus on efficiency. And all of that was starting to happen. It was just starting to happen. It wasn't going to happen all at once. Ontario's economy is an $800 billion a year economy. You cannot turn that on a dime. And the cap and trade program was a $1.9 billion a year program. We only let it run for 18 months. You have to expect that it would need to run for at least a decade to make significant changes. But even in that short period of time, what I found was really important things happening all over Ontario. But they're all over now. So, in the last 4 months, it's all been canceled. And the cap and trade has been brought to an end. The government is about to abolish our targets for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. It's not a surprise, I think, that we saw that huge loss of employment in July, just as the government was tearing up its contracts and all of these programs. These programs also brought money into Ontario, so if you think of the money that went to a company like General Motors to update their propulsion plant in St. Catharines. So they, on average, the industry's put in $4 for every dollar that we put in from cap and trade to invest in making their businesses more competitive and to reduce their operating costs. But anyway, all of that has been torn up, and we also tore up 752 clean energy contracts, damaging our reputation around the world as a place where you could rely on the rule of law. Did you know that we had a special statute to retroactively invalidate legal approvals given as far back as 2010 and to insulate the government for liability for breach of trust, breach of the Security Act, breach of fiduciary duty, any legal breach you like? And then in terms of our international reputation, in 2014, Ontario went around the world and invited the best renewable energy providers in the world to come and compete to provide us with clean energy at the lowest possible price. There were 106 expressions of interest. There were 16 projects which were awarded contracts, many of those with First Nations involvement, because that's part of reconciliation with First Nations, to give them a source of money, a possibility of employment, a link with a neighboring community. So 16 of those got their contracts in 2016. They've since spent millions of dollars going through the Ontario approval process. 10 of them had their contracts yanked in July. And I think 8 of those had significant First Nations involvement, all of which have been left high and dry. Do you think people around the world aren't hearing about this? Is Ontario a safe place to invest? They hear about it. Now in Brantford, you guys lost a lot of money. One of the things the government has done is even when there were approved projects, even when the money was already in local bank accounts and matching money had been raised and people had been hired, the money has been clawed back. So here's an example of some of the projects that were committed and approved for Brantford that have been canceled. And that money has been clawed back. And here's a few more. So you think about, you guys have heard about the state of the social housing, right? How many of you have seen those buildings? Any been into them when it's cold? Right? They've got generally bad building envelopes and bad heating and ventilation systems. And they cost a fortune to run, and the people in them are uncomfortable. So I had the privilege of going to 2 buildings in Sudbury, public housing buildings, that same sort of thing. Old buildings, bad systems, people freezing and baking. They got a little money from cap and trade. They managed to buy the equipment they needed from a small Ontario business, creating more work in Ontario. They've cut their heating costs in half, and now everybody in that building has a reasonable temperature in the winter. Like, that's what you were about to have, but you don't because the money got clawed back. We know that in Toronto, they were able to get in under the wire and get, I think, 23 buildings upgraded, and they're saving $57 million in heating costs. But we were doing all sorts of things that we really, really need. Those buildings still need upgrades. Those people in those buildings are still freezing in the winter. What are we going to do about that? Because we've just given up the only money we've found in 25 years to pay for the upgrades of these buildings. Now, it's clear the government is against cap and trade. Even though you might have noticed that the Nobel Prize for Economics was just given to the guy who's proven that carbon pricing is the cheapest and the fairest and the most effective way of reducing emissions. But okay, that's not what we want in Ontario. But we could still have a good law even without cap and trade. And so you'll see there's some things in my report about what that could look like, and I'm glad to talk about it if anybody's interested. Now, one of the consequences of getting rid of cap and trade is that we instead are going to have the federal carbon tax. I'm already on record, I already reported the federal carbon tax. It's a lot better than nothing. We need to have a price on carbon. Cap and trade was much better for Ontario. It was more efficient. It allowed the emissions to be made in a way that was less expensive. It allowed us to take advantage of cooperation across boundaries. But anyway, we didn't want that anymore. So it also provided money, by the way, for emission reductions in agricultural areas through offset programs. We don't have that, and because we don't have our own program, we therefore fall into the federal carbon tax, which, as you know, is going to start January 1st. And from the fuel tax point of view, it's going to start April 1st. And that, for many businesses, will be worse. Especially for smaller businesses, this will be much more expensive. It will be much more abrupt. A lot of time and effort was put into seeing a ramp-up, a slow ramp-up for cap and trade costs, but the federal charge is going to start with a lump on January 1st or April 1st. So if you're selling a business and you're looking at economics accounts and projections of revenue and so on, you better make sure you're thinking about the carbon tax and how that's going to affect people. As well as, of course, the questions of insurance that I talked about already. Now then there's the whole other side of it. So reducing emissions is critically important, but that's not the whole story anymore because it's too late to avoid having real impacts. When I do my whole climate science thing, people always ask me at the end, well, is it too late for us? And so I have to say, well, too late for what? Is it too late for that young person that you care about to have the same kind of life and the same kind of choices that you and I did growing up? Yes, it's too late for that. We threw that away. Is it too late to avoid having real impacts right here where we live? Yes. There was time for that in 1992, but it's too late for that now. But is it too late to make a real difference in what's ahead? And the answer is no. It's a small window, it's slipping away very quickly, but we're still in it. And if we throw this away, I think our kids are going to have something important to say to us. But emission reduction is part of it, and the other part of it is getting ready for what's coming. My mother told me stitch in time saves 9. Anybody else hear that from their mother? Okay. Well, it's just as true when it comes to getting ready for climate change. And we know it's coming. We know we're going to have warmer, wilder weather, much warmer, much wilder weather. Are we getting ready or not? Well, most people aren't. So my kids say they're just going to come to my house. I mean, yes, I'm going to have food and water and sleeping bags in a way of keeping us warm, but, you know, that's what if they can't get to me? We need to be able to be more prepared for what's ahead. And one of the things we need to know is just, where are we most vulnerable and what would that cost us? So going back to the UK experience again, and for those who are interested, if you are seriously interested in what happens when you have a real disastrous flood, the Pitt report after the 2007 UK floods is fabulous. But they looked at what happens in municipalities who a lot of people who get impoverished by flood. A lot of people don't have insurance, especially poorer people. What happens to them? Senior levels of government don't look after them. The municipality gets stuck with it. And so you can have a municipality that loses a lot of its own infrastructure and loses a lot of its tax rolls and then has responsibility for a lot of newly impoverished people. Plus, health effects, mental health effects, other kinds of things, demands on their social services. So, but one of the things also they showed is if you haven't figured out where you're going to be vulnerable, you can have what you count on in emergencies not being available. So they had an absolutely critical emergency communications line in a low-lying bridge. Guess what happened to that in the floods? And again, in Ontario, we haven't even gone through the exercise of saying, where are our emergency centers? And what will happen to them if there's a flood or a drought or a fire? Are they in the right place? Will they be able to operate? We haven't even done the work. So, we are just flying blind. We're just saying, oh, it won't happen here. We don't have to worry. Who thinks that's a safe assumption? I think physics will happen here just the way the rest of the world. So, we absolutely need to adapt, and we haven't even done the basics. We have to figure out where our vulnerabilities are. We need data. So, I mean, when I talk to municipalities, they just lost, I don't know, $150,000 pumping system, and they need to replace it, and they say to me, okay, well, what do we need to design for? What's coming? Well, Ontario doesn't know the answer to that. We've set up an organization that's supposed to work with the federal government to actually analyze that data and tell people what to build for, but we're not putting any money in it so it can run. And the third thing is, government is not going to be able to do all of this. There isn't enough money for government to do all of this for everybody and rescue everybody after every disaster, which is what people expect. It simply will not happen. We will run out of money. So we need a system to assist and encourage people, individuals, businesses, communities, to increase their own resilience, to prepare ahead, to think of that stitch in time saves 9, and not just rely blindly on the government, because that won't work. So, and we also know that, for example, our floodplain maps aren't up to date. 3/4 of the floodplain maps in Ontario haven't been updated. So if you're relying on the floodplain maps, you're probably relying on obsolete information. We also know it's basically a question of paying some now or paying more later, and we haven't had an honest conversation about who's going to pay. We haven't even started that conversation. We're having a revolt about paying, what was it, $264 a family? And that's just focusing on what people pay, not what they get for it, not what we're paying for. But it could cost so much more than that to deal with disasters and to start trying to make our equipment more resilient. It costs, let me just finish and I'll take questions. It costs, we know, enormously more to rebuild infrastructure from scratch than it does to maintain it and prepare it and have it ready. So we also know parts per quadrillion can matter. Now, most of the contaminated sites that you've heard of don't actually have a significant public health impact. Most of them don't have a significant environmental impact. But because of the law that we have, they have an enormous financial impact. And so an astonishing percentage of the time of environmental lawyers in Ontario is devoted to fights as to who among the innocent should pay for dealing with contaminated sites. Because that's probably why you came today, right? Fights among the innocent about who should pay. And that is taking an awful lot of the time because as the law has developed in Ontario, non-polluters also pay, and increasingly more and more. And they're often not compensated. So we have many, many cases where innocent people have been with enormous financial consequences as a result of one way or another having anything to do with a contaminated site. And the North Star case is a particularly outrageous example, although there are so many I can be outraged about. In that case, there was and again, I haven't worked in this case for years, I don't remember all the names anymore, but there was an original owner of the property in the 1970s who did spill chlorinated solvents. We could see the aerial photo, we can see the stain, we know where they put their waste solvent, they weren't careful with it. They may have deliberately put it on the ground because in the 60s, the official instructions from the manufacturer, what do you do with waste solvent? One of the options was to spread it on your parking lot and let it evaporate. Right? That was the approved method. And so lots of people did that. And besides, there wasn't any other way to do it. The other ways, what people were still doing in the 50s and 60s was pouring their industrial waste directly into the river. Right? The great improvement in 1971 was to say, okay, you have to pour it into a landfill site. So do you know where they poured it? They would go to old gravel pits and things. I had clients that even as late as 1988, the ministry was forcing them to take toxic industrial waste to mix it in with the household garbage and stir it into a completely unlined landfill so it could then run through the gravel deposits and contaminate all the groundwater for a great distance around. A lot of that is still there. There wasn't anything else. No one had figured out what to do with the stuff. We always look back and think, how stupid could they be? But honestly, we're being just as stupid, just on different stuff. Anyway, so this company sold its land, and I don't remember the year anymore, 1978 or something like that, to North Star Aerospace. North Star Aerospace was a company of the future, right? This was high-tech employment. This was a part of space. It was a great company that Canada was proud of, and they operated on that site for, roughly 20 years. And I can tell you that the ministry had no evidence that any contamination occurred during their operation. But I saw all that evidence, and there was no proof that any contamination occurred while North Star, the Canadian company, owned that property. And then I don't remember the years anymore. Anyway, at some point in 2000 and something or other, 2005, 2010, North Star did an environmental study of their property, and they found that they had chlorinated solvents, which they reported to the Ministry of Environment. They complied with the law. And for the next X years, and I don't remember if it was 5 years or 10 years, they spent $20 million, basically, of borrowed money to clean up that contamination as best they can, always with ministry approval, always with ministry backup, always with ministry praise, until they ran out of money. And they didn't run out of money because of the cleanup. They ran out of money, remember 2008? And after 2008, Boeing squeezed the company. But in the meantime, so the North Star company here that owned the land was a subsidiary of a parent company. The parent company had a board, and Baker, who was my client, Neil Baker, he joined the board of the parent company in 2009. Now by then, the Brantford company had closed down long ago, and the actual contamination had occurred decades before. And he checked and made sure that the ministry was happy with everything that North Star was doing before he went on the board. So while he was on the board of the parent company, the only thing that the Cambridge company did was spend borrowed money to clean up the contamination under ministry supervision. Do you think that was wrong? And then North Star ran out of money. So the ministry pushed them over the edge into bankruptcy, and then went after the individual officers and directors of the company to pay for the cleanup. Now, there's lots of other examples of this. Just so you know, the way this works is it's kind of blackmail. Is that the ministry ordered an amount of work, which was, I forget how many hundreds of thousands of dollars every month. And they were required to pay every month. They could appeal if they liked, but the appeal would probably take 5 years to resolve. In the meantime, they had to pay this hundreds of thousands of dollars every month out of their own personal pockets. So they settled. And then they set a precedent. It's good to go after the officers and directors of the parent company of the U.S. parent, even though they have nothing to do with causing the contamination and didn't do anything wrong. So that gave the ministry encouragement, and they went after more people. So one of the people they went after was in the, I think it was in the Welland area. So there was a contaminated site there. And again, it was a small industrial building. There was nothing very impressive about it. And the owner of the company did some cleanup, and then they hired a real estate agent to sell the property. Well, actually, let me try that again. They hired an accountant to sell the property, and the accountant hired a real estate agent, and the real estate agent got a key and put a lockbox on, the way you guys do. And guess who the ministry went after? The accountant. This was a landlord, by the way. The contamination was all caused by a former tenant. So they went after the accountant, they went after the real estate company, and they went after the officers and directors of the real estate company personally for the cost of cleanup of this site. Do you think that's fair? Okay, but that's what the ministry thinks is appropriate, because it's their view that fairness is an irrelevant consideration, that the only thing that matters is finding money from somebody to pay for the cleanup, and they don't care who. If you have something to do with the property, because the word control has been interpreted in a very elastic way, if If you have something to do with the property, that, they say, gives them justification to order you to pay for an investigation, which can cost many millions, and a cleanup, which can cost tens of millions. And they don't care if it's an individual or a company, and they don't care about fault. They only care about whether they can make somebody pay. And they do. So we end up with this situation where non-polluters also pay and are definitely not always compensated. There's lots of argument about how much you should have to pay, how much you have to clean, what counts as clean, what work methods work as clean. There's lots of consultants who say they know what they're doing in cleaning these things up. I can tell you from my experience, they don't all. The ministry has a very broad discretion in how they use their powers, and they're not accountable to anybody about how they use that discretion. Other thing I would say is, yes, of course, you need to be suspicious of contamination when there's been an industry on a property, but lots of other sites get contaminated even if there hasn't been an industry on the property. Those of you who handle rural land, have you ever seen somebody with a burn pit at the back? Or maybe someplace where they spilled a barrel of pesticides? Or maybe just use their pesticides a little freely? Some of the apple growing lands have got so much arsenic in it, I won't let my kids go there. You can have oil contamination in any place that used to have an oil heater. So contamination can occur almost anywhere. You get other kinds of contamination that you get. I had a friend actually who decided to refinish her doors, and she took her doors outside and sanded them outside on the vegetable garden with their little home sander. Yes, well, okay, so what did they create? What's in paint, guys? Right. Is lead an acceptable contamination in residential soil? So anything can be contaminated. Generally, every site is contaminated in their own way, and sometimes the rules are just totally stupid. So one of the fun things we have, there's all sorts of boundary issues. Have any of you had issues with salt on a property? Okay, well, lucky you so far. So I had a client with a piece of land that had been approved for residential redevelopment. They were going to put up a condo or something. And one of the conditions that the city put on the approval, the rezoning approval, was that they had to preserve a large, beautiful silver maple tree at the corner of the property. But in order to get their mortgage, so that they were released the first tranche of the mortgage to do the excavation so that they could prove that they met the ministry cleanup criteria. And the ministry cleanup criteria has salt parameters. So the good news is, if the salt comes from a highway, they don't count it. But if it comes from a parking lot, they do count it. Now, how are you going to know whether it came from a parking lot or the road? You don't. Anyway, this property had a parking lot, and they had used salt in the parking lot, so some of the salt probably came from the parking lot, so they had to comply with the salt rules. And do you know why we have salt rules? To protect vegetation. Where was a lot of the salt? In the roots of the tree, exactly. So you can't wash salt out of the soil very effectively, so the only way to get all the salt out was to excavate. And if you excavate, what do you do to the tree? All right, and if you kill the tree, you've invalidated your zoning approval. So what would you do in that circumstance? Well, yeah, I mean, in that particular case, I was able to do a bit of magic because I had some favors I called in, and we had a little magical pretense. So we got a fancy arborist to come and stand there. We got a batch of guys with shovels, and the guys with shovels dug and dug until the arborist said, "Stop digging," and then we all pretended the salt was gone. Okay. I didn't say this was sensible. These are the kinds of problems that we had to deal with. But it definitely helps to understand the chemistry. That was one of the things I spent a lot of time doing. Different contaminants require different kind of treatment. You cannot assume that the consultants necessarily understand the chemistry. The clients never do. I found it very helpful to understand the consultant's lingo. I had a lot of people get into trouble because they thought a phase 1 environmental site assessment told them something reliable about the condition of the property. It does not. And no matter what happens, it's all very expensive. So there we are. So what about fairness? Well, that's what people keep asking me. What about fairness? Don't we have fairness in the law in Ontario? And I have to say, in this area, we do not. It really is a high-stakes game of hot potato. If you happen to be the one who holds the property and everybody else is gone, and you look as if you've got money, they may come after you because they don't care about fairness. And no, it's not fair. So before I became commissioner, my office did report on this in much more measured terms than I would use now. But I have not reported on contaminated sites in my time as commissioner. But yes, what the government does, I think it's immoral. I think worse than immoral, I think it's also ineffective. It means that people won't redevelop contaminated sites. It means we have a lot of contaminated sites just fenced off, sterilized. That's not good for the community, it's not good for anybody else, because it's too dangerous for anybody to invest in trying to make these things better. We've driven out, to my knowledge, we've driven out tens of millions of dollars of investment in Ontario. I'm sure there's many others. And every time we make an unreasonable decision, we make it less likely that people will invest in these sites, or we're willing to take a listing for a site. I mean, are you going to take a listing for a site you think is contaminated and put your personal assets at risk? Why would you do that? So we've got a bad law, it's got bad economic consequences. It drives. So, there's a new government. Maybe this is something that they'll fix. You could talk to your MPP about it. I can't fix it for you, but thank you for your attention.